thick cloud caught a piper cub's tail, a match struck blue on a railroad rail. The old puff horse was just pulling through, and a man wore a peg leg forever. I'm on the bum where the hobos run. There breaks with filthy chatter. Oh, I don't care, there's no place there. I don't think it matters. My skin's blazing through and my clothes in tatters. And the railroad looked like a Y up the hill of ladders. One shoe fell on the gravel, one stick poked down. Gray of age fell down on a pair of ears. An eagle shined through my whole watch pocket.
Well, hello there and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor Dupre and today's guest is no stranger to Second Life. It's a yellow duck, also known as Jonathan Lethem. Hello and how are you?
I'm great and so delighted to be here again and in this familiar, impossible place.
We're not in Brooklyn. Now, I really loved your new novel, but I have to tell you that first when I got it, it was like, why Brooklyn? Ugh, why can't he write about California? I mean, my American phase was 100% California. Then 2 minutes later, I start reading it, and I'm sitting here absorbed with Google Maps open, figuring out where these characters live, the sense of the place, the geography of it, and then it gets better and better, and the ending is just wonderful. And then I felt I need to cancel this book club, and you know why, Jonathan? Because I feel when we dissect these things, these books that are meaningful, I feel like I'm kind of cheating myself and the audience. And it's weird because I'm a trained musician with music. I understand how it works, and I can still enjoy it. And with books, it's so magical. I'm just a reader. I mean, I understand it a little bit now by interviewing you guys, but it's weird. Anyway, you also teach. I mean, how should we proceed, Jonathan, to still enjoy books without demystifying it?
Thank you it's a great question. First of all, I'm never scared of description, and I think that description is the word that I prefer to explanation, because I don't think, even as the person who put these sentences in order, when I regard the result when I experience the result as I'm making it, I don't sense that I'm in command of every meaning that's being generated. Language and consciousness are too intricate for this. So to delve into them and attempt to make descriptive forays is no threat to their mystery for me. It's only exciting. And in a way, the book itself, it's a series of inquiries. It's a very, discursive book for a novel. But I think it only gets more strange and mysterious for all of its attempts to make itself transparent or to stop. I make a point in this book of saying I'm going to tell as well as show. Mm-hmm. So, I sort of stop the book and try to explain my purpose a number of times, or the book tries to explain its purpose, because I think in a way the book has a voice that's not me. Mm-hmm. It's like a piece of ventriloquism where the dummy takes over.
And it's so weird because I think it's on page 10 where you describe something with really flowery language, and then the narrator, whoever that is, we don't know that. I don't know if we ever know. Then the narrator says, "Oh no, scrap that, like honeydew, whatever it was."
Absolutely, no honeyed light.
Yeah. It's
no
like
lyricism.
It's either, and my association was, okay, this is kind of a screenplay, and he gets it back from the producer or something, or. It's like, no, we can't have that dialogue. That's crap.
Great.
Or from the actor even, or from the editor. And the structure is awesome. Yeah.
Well, in a way, that's really a great description. I never thought of it as a screenplay that had been, mercilessly annotated by a group of actors who were asked to fulfill it in performance. But that's a good metaphor for my feeling about this book, which is that the characters had very important corrections and ideas and objections. Really, even some of them didn't want the book to exist. They didn't want it to be written, and they all got their different voices to activated. I welcomed every contradiction onto the page. So when this is the form that the inquiry takes, you can't really puncture the mystery, because it's the mystery of existence, which we all are immersed in and all are endlessly trying to name and explain, but that's an inexhaustible pursuit.
Now, let's set a little bit the scene here. What is this book about? You're talking about inquiries. I heard the term gentrification thrown around. I mean, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
Good. And there's also a couple in it.
Yeah.
Let me say one more thing. When it's really okay. I actually I'm getting ahead of myself, because I was going to talk about this couple in the book that regrets buying. Anyway, what is this book about? Why should I care about Brooklyn?
Thank you. It's good. We have enough time. We should be direct while we can be. So I grew up in Brooklyn. I'm almost 60 years old. I'll turn 60 next month. So the time I remember in my body, in that extraordinarily supercharged period of existence called childhood or coming of age, is the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s, especially the 70s into the 80s. And I've written about it a couple of times before. I wrote a book called Motherless Brooklyn, which made a first touch on the autobiographical mystery of my feeling about this place, my confused and conflicted feelings about this time and place, Brooklyn in the 1970s and 80s. And then I wrote a very committed book called The Fortress of Solitude, which was openly autobiographical and openly conflicted about, was this a great or terrible place to be a person when you're a child, a white boy living in a gentrifying, mixed up, extremely diverse neighborhood in the United States in the 1970s? Was Brooklyn a disaster area, or was it a enchanted playground? Well, of course, for me, it was both of these things. Mm-hmm. So I wrote this book, which is a book that meant an enormous amount to me, called The Fortress of Solitude, and it was published over 20 years ago. And for a long time, I thought I'd exhausted this subject. I'd spoken very extensively and passionately about the idea of gentrification and the idea of racial conflict in childhood, and the sense of needing to escape a place you were from, even though it was the only place you knew, and it formed you, and it was fascinating to you, but you needed to run away from it, all of which were feelings that related to experiences I'd had, but had, of course, been also transformed by fiction, which is what fiction will do. Anyway, I thought, this is exhaustive. This is complete. I've said what I need to say about coming of age in this time and place. And for more than a decade, that satisfied me. It was a book that meant an extreme amount to me. Usually, if people ask me what my most personal book is, or what maybe I thought my best book is, I would point to it. And something changed. Something began to happen. As I grew older and the world changed, and experiences that everyone had in Brooklyn and elsewhere of the continuing gentrification, the continuing progress of capitalism, and the paradoxes and problems that this imposes on societies, neighborhoods, cultures, families, I began to look at the book as one attempt, but an incomplete one, to talk about these things that meant so much to me. And suddenly I was a different person. Brooklyn was changed again. In many ways it was, I tried to freeze it in a book, but it didn't freeze. It kept changing. Mm. And also the world transformed. The way we talk about race, Black Lives Matter occurred, and the dynamics, and Trumpism occurred, and the dynamics around my own experiences started to need new descriptions. Or anyway, new descriptions became possible. And to me, they felt urgent. So I began to want to, in a way, tear up the first attempt. I'm very proud of The Fortress of Solitude, but I wanted, in a sense, to write a book that was almost pitted against it, that said, I have a whole other way of looking at this, and I want to write as if that book is an impediment, a problem to thinking clearly. Because I think when you try to freeze something in time, in literary space, you can tell a lot of truth, but you may also make a lot of myth. And even for yourself, as the writer, you've made a myth.
And the book is very fragmented, and we'll talk about this fantastic structure in a little bit. But as you're talking, I just realized also that what has become very apparent to me is that you love there's so many different characters in there, and it seems to me you love all of them except for the writer. I don't know. There is, of course, the writer who lives in Brooklyn. Actually, he grew up in that neighborhood, and then he writes about it. We'll talk about that too. But first, this is about Borum Hill, which I think a character calls then Boring Hell, I guess.
Boring Hell, yeah. Boredom Hill was another word for it. A gentler word would be Boredom Hill. But
so where is that but what is so special? Because I have a whole bunch of Google Maps. As you're talking, I'm going to flip through these Google Maps here because I wanted to get a sense of this neighborhood. It's just like really this small area. It's not the whole of Dean Street, because Dean Street, where this stuff is happening, goes all the way towards the east there.
Yeah. No, it's actually a very small neighborhood. But in childhood, a single city block can be a universe.
It's a universe, yep.
And as your territory expands, it does so, incrementally. So then, soon you may walk 4 blocks from your home, and it's another reality entirely. Different people live there. So I wanted to capture this sense of a microcosm. But the thing to know about Borum Hill, and that the book is very concerned with, is that it's also a fiction. Even though it's real and people live there, it's an idea. Because when you name a neighborhood, and this neighborhood was named, during my lifetime, it was really just a chunk of what some people might call downtown Brooklyn or South Brooklyn or Gowanus. Some people sometimes would call it North Gowanus, but it was a very indistinct series of blocks. It contained interesting houses and one very dynamic commercial street called Atlantic Avenue, which was in total decline when I was a kid. Now it's a very fabulous place to go and buy, go to boutiques and antique shops and eat at expensive restaurants. At the time that I first knew it, it was half boarded up. It was almost an abandoned zone. But anyway, this was conceived. People wanted to live in a place that made a certain kind of sense to them, and so this name was given to it as part of this effort. So one of the subjects of this book is how the places we live are themselves myths or fictions. They're constructions in conceptual, historical, and commercial space. Real estate. Mm-hmm. Real estate is a big subject here.
Okay, a little going into right now, because real estate, I also looked at Zillow for Borum Hill, and the brownstones there, they go, I don't know, between like 2 to 4 or 5 million, maybe.
It's a very glamorous place to live now. A lot of movie stars live there, and it's, I think, these things probably are debatable, and different statistics might produce different results, but I think it's, the last I knew, I'd heard a claim that it was the second most expensive neighborhood in all of New York City, which, for that to be true in Brooklyn, anywhere, as opposed to Manhattan, is revolutionary, really. When I was growing up, all of Brooklyn was kind of the backwater. It was all on the wrong side of the tracks. Manhattan was where there was money and glamour. So that itself tells you a story of an enormous transformation.
Now the story takes place. You jump around, but it's mainly in the 70s, I would say, but also after the civil rights era. And you just said it was an idea. by whom? And before you answer that, I want to put up this slide here, this little excerpt that I chose. Um, and in the book, it's a very diverse neighborhood. There is people from all sorts of backgrounds, black, white, Jewish, Italian, etc. This is an excerpt where you write about the people who come into this neighborhood, the white people primarily, and you write, the white boys here made no sense to begin with. These Jew, fallen wasp, hippie, communist, artist made creatures, referring to their parents. In kindergarten, they, the white boys, actually do hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Parental idealism casts the white boys into a dream world. What incredible luck that just a minute before you came along, we solved all these conundrums thanks to civil rights, reefer, and jazz appreciation. Now go out on the street and play. And so this is a wonderful excerpt for people who haven't read the book that to me shows so clearly that this is so from, I mean, the parents are very clueless. Or maybe they do know, but they don't admit it to themselves. And the kids, they have to navigate these streets every day. And there are issues, some of them small, some of them big. And the parents are sort of, I don't know, who are these parents, John? Is this sort
Well,
of an indictment of your own parents in a way?
you've read the book very adeptly, Drax, in the sense that the energy in this book, when I wrote The Fortress of Solitude, ironically, of course, I was much younger, obviously, 20 years younger, and I wasn't yet a parent, and I was closer to the experience of my own childhood. But I think in many ways, when I wrote it the first time, my first attack on this confusing scene, I was much more identified with the parents, and I made them into very fully rounded characters and shared a lot of my love, the love you mentioned earlier. I shared a lot of my love for the confused but also, well-intentioned and culturally interesting kind of boomers, because that's the generation that we're talking about, who had chosen to be the first white occupants of this black and brown neighborhood, or among the first, because it was always a neighborhood with many different kinds of lives being lived in it, and there were even some white people who'd never left, some who were
Right.
Continuous. But so my parents' generation.
So that's interesting to me. Who I really had not a big concept of Brooklyn. So it's not that white people just sort of invaded this neighborhood, right? I mean, it was just a specific a specific type of white person.
Exactly. It was a kind of next type of white person, which we now recognize as the first wave gentrifier. We had no name for this at the time, and the word gentrification didn't exist. That's a really important thing to understand, is that we take this for granted now, this framework that we can place these kinds of actions in. But when in the mid-'60s, hippies, queer people, artists, especially so many kinds of artists, and just poor white leftists who needed places to live and wanted to move where there are cheap apartments or even whole buildings, when they first came into a neighborhood like the one that became Boerum Hill, no one said, "Uh-oh, look out, the gentrifiers are coming." Mm-hmm. No one knew what it was. It was idealistic, in fact. It was represented in many of the views at the time a kind of expression of a continuity with the sentiments of the civil rights era, which was we should all live together, and that white flight from the cities had been a terrible disaster, and that people should come back and claim these beautiful buildings and revitalize these neighborhoods. There was a woman named Jane Jacobs who was the sort of champion of the idea of living in cities and neighborhoods specifically, which would be diverse and have ground level variety of race and class and culture within them. So the people who were doing this, and we're speaking, of course, of my parents and their friends, among many others, they saw themselves romantically, not in any way as, a yellow alert that, the next thing that's going to happen is real estate values are going to go up and the speculators are going to come in and the yuppies will appear. There were no yuppies. These were hippies who did this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found them fascinating growing up. They were often more interesting. My parents and their friends were often, truthfully, more interesting to me than my friends, or at least rivaled in interest, my friends. And I wrote about them in some ways, very sentimentally. I mean, I saw them tragically, but, I tried to evoke their subjectivity in Fortress of Solitude. But now it's about finally circling back to your question and the excerpt you read, Drax. This book is quite angry at those people and treats them as a kind of cartoon of ignorance or
hypocrisy also. I mean, I think
hypocrisy. Absolutely,
you're very spot on, because I mean, I know these people. I know a lot of these people who would say, "Oh, play together. It's all good. Oh, look, everybody's playing," and then it's almost like the clock. The timer went off and said, "Okay, now you go to private school, or we'll send you away from here." And it's just completely absurd that they use these sort of token diversity friends while they already have the plan for their kids and I think you're right about I have it somewhere, I'll find it, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, there's so many species, of course, of person that we're lumping together here, and many different kinds of motives or versions of this hypocrisy you described. But the experience that maybe is the most universal among them as parents, and it's not unique to Borum Hill or to Brooklyn, but it's because you find evidence of this described in all kinds of American recollections by Gen Xers of what their parents were like, is that they were the me generation, and they were what we received as childhoods were, on the one hand, blessed by a kind of a free range quality, right? We were not micromanaged. These were not the helicopter parents.
No.
But they
Who
also
needs seat belts if you can just sleep in the back of the car, right?
Yes, exactly. So this is the positive side, and I experienced much of the virtue of that positive side. It means a tremendous amount to me that I got to invent my own reality. On the other hand, I had to invent my own reality because they were very self-absorbed, and they were very oblivious to some of the things that might be happening. In this case, the street life was completely incomprehensible to them. But we kids had no choice but to understand it on our terms, because we were not offered any equipment by our parents, because they couldn't parse it. What was going on the street level, on the sidewalks, on the way to school, or when we were sent out to play, was beyond their comprehension. And this is one of the things that really describes the reality that I'm portraying in this book. One thing I did, Drax, we can talk about this quite a lot, or I can just mention it quickly, but this book depends on a lot more research and a lot more conversation than anything I've ever written before. And the conversations and the research were among people who had overlapping experiences with mine. Girls, boys, black, white, Dominican, Puerto Rican, every kind of kid who was approximately my age, and their younger brother and their older sister. It's a kind of oral history compilation. It's one reason the book has this contradictory quality, because it's a gigantic Rashomon project, right? Everyone sees it a little differently. But the one thing every kid, I had a questionnaire, and I would give these people.
So you did like a whole big survey of not only,
absolutely,
but only people that you knew, or then also they may recommended other people that you maybe didn't
exactly.
know?
I leaped from my friends and my acquaintances and my own siblings onto people that I couldn't have found without help. So second and third layer, kids from the neighborhood. But I really went to a lot of them, and I talked to them about this idea of this fundamentally criminal world that we existed in. And I gave them a questionnaire. It was about 25 questions about childhood and crime and the city. And, questions like, what's the first famous crime that you remember that came through to you? And, of course, as you might expect, so many of them, the answer was Son of Sam, or Bernard Goetz, or the kidnapping of Eton Patz. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, but I put them into the book because they were these universalizing images of crime. But I also said, what's the first famous crime in your neighborhood? And then you'd get a different answer, because we had our own sort of verbal tabloid culture. What crimes the kids talked about, this famous mugging or stabbing that everyone in the neighborhood whispered about. But the whisper was quite loud collectively, so it was almost like we had our own urban myths, our local urban myths. But anyway, I'm wandering a bit. The thing I wanted to say is there was much that was divergent and surprising and contradictory in the information I pulled into this book. But the two questions that every kid who answered my questionnaire agreed on. One question was, did you commit a crime?
Okay.
Everyone, no matter how bullied or white or helpless or obedient you might be, at some point you wrote some graffiti on a wall, or you shoplifted a cupcake or a candy bar, and usually you did quite a lot more. Everyone was a criminal. However much they were victims, we were all criminals in those days too. It was how you enunciated your relation to the city was to be a criminal.
I was just going to throw in a little teaser, because that reminds me of, I think you start with these two boys who are sewing quarters in half.
Right, they're sewing quarters in half.
And you go like, what the hell are they doing? And then it makes total sense later on what they're doing. Anyway, go ahead. It's right, and one of the things they're doing that they know is they're finding a form of criminal mischief that that makes them feel that they belong in this reality. So the second question that every single respondent to my questionnaire, every kid for miles around that I spoke with, again, girl, boy, black, white, brown, whatever, newcomer or lived there forever, whatever they were, I said, did you feel you could talk to your parents about what was going on the street? And every single one, the reply was, are you kidding me? Now, it was beyond the possibility. I was going to say, what has changed? My son is 20, and we just had a conversation because he got into a fight, and we were talking about like, oh, how do you get into fights? I was like, well, it just happens, out there, and this stuff is happening. And then I realized, like, I sounded like a complete fool. Where like, in my day, because I always felt like I'm pretty in touch, I mean, I was not a normal obedient kid. I mean, I was not a complete rebel, but I thought I was much more in touch. But then I realized, wait a minute, and I was just reading your book at the same time. I was like, it hasn't, that there is a disconnect. You may care a lot and you have an open channel, and we do, but this is a completely different world that he lives in.
They live in their own world, almost no matter how much you may try to prevail or interfere or hover. And so, of course, parenting styles are very different now.
Exactly, because now we got this wonderful, like you mentioned, we got helicopter, we got bubble wrap parenting, we got all sorts of all kinds.
But that doesn't mean that they're not inventing their own reality, as they ought to be, as is necessarily the situation.
This is what
one of the biggest differences for me. So I said, it's paradoxical because I was further from my own childhood. But on the other hand, I became a parent since my last attempt to write about this time. And that means that my subjectivity is, in a way, spread into these two, in fact, as they happen to be, boys who are coming of age, who are becoming teenagers, while I'm writing this book.
Now, if you're just tuning in on YouTube, or if you're just coming here to the beach, we're obviously not in Brooklyn. We're still on the set from your last appearance, which was for the arrest. And I just actually see here in the audience a fellow by the name of Ulrich Blumenbach, who is an amazing.
Saw that Ulrich is with us.
Ulrich is right there, and I think it just came out, Der Stillstand, the arrest in German, or maybe it's coming out next month, I forgot. But Ulrich is just amazing. Yeah, he translated the arrest.
Yeah, wonderful to see him there. I hope you'll have, I know we'll have time for other voices, so I'm going to hope I'll hear from Ulrich and everyone with the questions.
And we do
Yeah.
take questions as well, and Shyla is going to feed them to me. Dex is saying here, similarly to Adam Savage, I reject a reality and create my own. I'm not 100% sure what he's referring to here in this comment. But what I wanted to actually talk about, since you mentioned sort of this free range parenting, we need to clarify a few terms. Where is it? So there was free range parenting, but the parents did care, at least in the sense that they gave you guys mugging money. Now, I'm going to throw a few terms out that you use in the book. Can you explain what that is?
Yes. So this is one of the places where the double thinking is really evident. And we all know that we all have many parts of our existence that we deal with by having two irreconcilable conclusions and never letting one of them, never letting the right hand see what the left is doing. So at some point, there became a consensus. Who knows how these things arise? It's like asking the question of who is the author of a joke that suddenly everyone is telling, right? But everyone understood that the way to navigate the streets, because there was a kind of ritual bullying or mugging on the street level, on the child level. It always feels wrong to me to call what happens between children a mugging, but it was a transfer of money from one person to another that was going to happen so routinely, with so many ritual aspects and so predictably, that it was strategic simply to, have some designated money to hand over, while perhaps you would hide elsewhere on your person the rest of your money. So in your sneaker or your sock, you might have, let's say, $2 or $3, which in those days was a lot. It was, more than several slices of pizza and several rides on the subway or whatever you might want to do to have $2 or $3. And you'd have 50 cents in quarters in your front pocket to be taken away from you. And you would just have made this kind of bargain. And it was not something that parents were not aware of. In fact, if you weren't getting the memo on the street, it was, some people's parents might say, well, you should have some mugging money like your friend over there, And
but it's so interesting because it suggests, again, that, like what we said earlier, that the parents are kind of aware in a certain sense that it's not all fine and dandy and you can't just sing Kumbaya all the time and then everything goes away.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It means that they were stuck inside a system of experiences and understandings that they couldn't operate, couldn't make cohere. So they could only make little local patches, a Band-Aid here or there. But thinking about the implications or the meanings or the psychological, what would you call it, like, long-term emotional or psychological results was more than they could bear. So they only applied these little local Band-Aids, or what we might now call hacks, right? Street hacks.
Now, there's so many great. I wrote down a whole bunch of really my favorite lines, but this is kind of on topic too because of the kind of communication, not breakdown, but just lack of communication. There is one guy in the novel referred to as the millionaire's son or the millionaire's family, and they're pretty dysfunctional as far as they. I mean, yeah, I don't know in what the pecking order of dysfunctionalities of the characters, but here you're right. The three humans in this millionaire's family, the mother, father, son, make a vivid display of being 100% inaudible to one another. Or is that just families in general?
Well, one of the biggest differences between most fiction and most of real life is that in fiction people answer one another's questions or show evidence even of hearing the important part of what other people are saying.
Because it needs to be, now you're revealing, you're demystifying again, Jonathan. I don't want to hear it.
I'm sorry, I'm demystifying. It creates energy and meaning when characters seem to hear each other and react to each other, because then you believe that they that everything matters, right? And in fiction, everything should matter. But, one of the best early insights I had, mind-blowing, one of thousands, of course, of epiphanies I had reading great novels when I was young, was I started to see authors having people say things that no one listened to, or sometimes, repeatedly, or two people talking to each other and not hearing each other. And I thought, this is meaningful. And so I'm exaggerating that particular epiphany into an instance here of a permanent system, because of course families exist that way at times, all of them probably at times, and some much more. The millionaire's family are absurd. Of course, they're not even really millionaires, right? They're just that's their legendary role on the street.
Right.
By today's standards, they wouldn't strike anyone as being wealthy, particularly.
They're being perceived by the kids. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Where do I have that slide? Because of course we mentioned Captain Beefheart, and of course I'm reading here, and they're at the Millionaire's Son. The father's sorry, no, this is this is at the board games. I get it mixed up, but people do know that I'm a big Frank Zappa fan, and of course by extension I'm also a big Captain Beefheart fan. And here is an exchange with kids, where one kid starts browsing the dad's record collection, and then he says, "Oh, this is worth the whole collection. This is the motherfucking shit right here. Trout Mask replica. Here we have ourselves a soundtrack." So this is a Captain Beefheart record that everybody needs to know or own. And then, of course, also you name check Frank Zappa here. This is a line, I'm reading it, I'm putting it on the slide projector. They're stalling until they're older, until they're taller, until summer camp in Pennsylvania when they can pretend they're not from where they're from, until they get into Stuyvesant or go off to college. Culturally, they're inclined to work the margins, sustaining themselves on Mad Magazine and Frank Zappa and wacky packages. Sardonic attitudes to keep from having to regard anything, most particularly their own emotional reality, from an unironic point of view. Why for you is Frank Zappa, for these Dean Street boys, for these kids, for these white kids? Why did you choose Zappa? I'm just curious. Or were there other contenders for describing their cultural affiliation?
Well, I mean, there are many rival pieces of cultural equipment out there. Although, of course, one of the great mysteries, I like that you began this description by reminding us of the physical act of flipping through, records in a space, because we now live in the kind of inside the jukebox.
Spotify, yes. Oh God.
We live inside the jukebox, and I'm often trying to, again, my children help me think about this difference. The mystery of a culture where, I might hear, like, I was a Talking Heads fan when I was 14 years old. And I wore that on my sleeve. I thought I was very important for being a Talking Heads fan. It defined who I was. And then a couple of, older brothers of friends might say to me something like, "Well, if you like that, you'd probably get into the Velvet Underground." I mean, half of that just comes from the Velvet Underground. And this would register with me. I would hear the signal. I would know that this was a signal for me. But by what means was I going to explore it? I couldn't find a Velvet Underground record if my life depended on it. I couldn't go to Spotify or YouTube, obviously. So it was just an idea. It was a mysterious name for an unknown quantity. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So at that time, there are only the things that you do find. The one kid who's got an older brother who brings home a Trout Mask replica. It's like a church. Everybody comes to touch the holy relic. And we didn't exist in a place where we could rely upon, anyone to organize our attention. There was no curation. It was rumor and intuition, and then these weird leaps you'd take, and you'd grab onto something. My brother got into Funkadelic, Mm-hmm. When he brought those records home, I couldn't believe they existed. I thought it looked like something that had been made up from an alternate reality. Mm-hmm. The irony is, of course, the best resource we had were the hipster parents. Even though we wanted to hate them, they might have some information we needed on their bookshelves or in their record collections, And so while we were waiting for punk rock to come along and create something that belonged only to us, because it would be indecipherable, or they would sense in it the rejection of their values. When you finally have the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, it doesn't sound like hippie music anymore, and you're like, thank fucking Christ, it's not going to be. My parents are not going to turn out to have already been into this.
This is so amazing. Yeah, this is
Right.
amazing that putting myself into a mindset where somebody just a little older than me from that generation would reject some stuff that for me is like a holy grail if I had it on vinyl, basically.
Well, that's the thing, is we were conflicted, and in order to form identities, I mean, I'm speaking now of specifically sort of the punk, which was like it was like a rescue for us. Came along, it required, unfortunately, that we exaggerate the mistakes or the wrongness or the insufficiencies of all the great psychedelic hippie music, because it almost comes down to Johnny Lydon's T-shirt, which says, fuck Pink Floyd. We were like, okay, that's the end of that. Well, now, I love Pink Floyd, it turns out. But I had to really hate them for a little while. It was quite clear, because the first time I heard Dark Side of the Moon, it was at a absolutely total hip parents, stoner party where everyone was dancing to the soundtrack to The Harder They Come, and and then I pulled out The Dark Side of the Moon. I might have been 12 or 13 years old, and got them to put that on. It didn't belong to me, So now this weight of enduring a cultural space where you have to, the street wasn't going to deliver either Frank Zappa or Captain Beefheart or the Ramones to me. These things were forays. They had to be forays into the unknown.
Now, since we're on voice, if people have comments or want to ask questions, because I saw Ulrich has an open mic, please feel free to just jump in and rudely interrupt me. That's the only way to shut me up. My wife knows it. But in the meantime, because we talked about the character of the writer before, here is a little excerpt where a character by the name of the Wheeze, who hates the writer, says in conversation with another Dean Street boy, "So you were a bullied child? We all were. Don't make a verschlungene religion of it like that writer." This is the only way the Wheeze will ever refer to him, that writer. He means that Dean Street boy who lived among us and wrote a novel. And for the YouTube folks and for the folks in the world, I'm now going to put the camera here on a little prop that our prop master Arietu made earlier this morning, and it's a fake book, and the book title is "Take Me to the Bridge," and the author is Dean S. Boy, and it was published by Borum Hill Publishing, and there's even blurbs in the back. I'm reading the blurbs. This book is rad, Jonathan Lethem. Then Draxtor Dupre says, "Why is Jonathan Lethem using the term rad? Does he still live in the 90s? Captain Beefheart says, "If I were not a musical icon and a painter, I could have written this book, but I'm short on time." And then a fellow by the name of Anonymous Antiquarian says, "You gentrified gentrification, and you know it." Now, Jonathan, this writer character, what is he being accused of here by the Wheeze? Like, is it just like monetizing and also sort of airbrushing a complex childhood?
Well, I think there's probably a few things. I mean, the Wheeze is an extremely eloquent and also almost free associating sensibility. he doesn't always make sense, right? So a lot of the things that bother him get folded together into this complaint. But what is it to gentrify gentrification? What he hates about the book is that simultaneously, this writer, who's a kind of like a bad version of me, right? Like, what if The Fortress of Solitude was 75% worse than it is? That's the sort of the game I'm playing in this book, right? Mm-hmm. It's really something that everyone should feel completely exhausted by. So what he feels about this book is two things that contradict. On the one hand, he feels that the writer put his own, sulky, hurt feelings about being a white kid who had problems on the street in the foreground and ignoring many other much more interesting possible subjects. So he's snobbish about it. He thinks that, in the current phrase would be that the writer of this book, Take Me to the Bridge, too much centers his own pain. It's a kind of although it's not a memoir, it's got the errors that we associate with what's called the trauma memoir, where every piece of information is organized indexed according to the hurt feelings of the author, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's one side of his complaint. But on the other side of his complaint, and he's not looking at he's not resolving the contradiction between these two different things, is that he hates that the author absorbed so many other white boys' stories, including his own, and ascribed them to the main character in his book. So he feels usurped in his own trauma and his own experience by the way the book did accurately, but without crediting him, capture something uniquely intimate and painful in his own life.
But that's why. But is he then just sort of pissed off that he's not sort of has a bigger role to play, or that he is being absorbed into a composite character with others? I mean, I guess it's kind of the same thing. But
it's
that's what a writer has to do. No?
Aesthetically, well, right, of course. If you got him at another angle, or if you calmed him down, or you'd say, well, isn't that how novels work? With conflations and simplifications and exaggerations, it's how they make their form of truth. But this doesn't feel good to him because it's been done to his own baseline life experience.
And I think that's now I understand why you didn't give most people a name. I mean, there's probably many reasons for it, but now, in the context of what the Wheeze is sort of pissed about, makes total sense that you circumvent that by not giving people names. You just call them white boys. Go ahead.
Yes. In some ways, this book tries to be the book that the Wheeze would like to see, right? That it distributes all the information and all the experience as broadly and as widely as reality does, as opposed to centralizing it the way a novel does. Of course, it fails. Because even if you don't give characters names, the human mind makes stories, makes characters. So in the absence of the normal apparatus of fiction, which in some ways, I've declined to offer the reader certain kind of familiar organizing ideas or instruments, let's say, for operating this novel. One of the simplest instruments that the author offers is saying, here's someone, they're the main character, and here's their name. Well, I've taken those things away. Mm-hmm. But it happens anyway. And in the absence of those things, you know what becomes the main character of the book? The voice becomes the main character. Mm-hmm. You identify with whoever's talking to you. And since there is a kind of denied but undeniable narrator, he tries not to exist, but he exists. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We come to understand that there is a main character. The main character is the sensibility that's creating this book, which, of course, very much like a typical autobiographical novel, both is and isn't me.
Now, it may be we, or it may be, yes.
Here, it wants to be collective. It wants to speak for everyone.
Now, I would say Jonathan, if you could get ready to read little passage chapter 57, we have prepared, and magically out of the sand here will a lectern will appear in Second Life. I hope that this will happen. In the
Great.
meantime, as you get ready, because you're talking about the narrator, here's another little excerpt that kind of shows how uh, what you do with the structure, how the narrator weaves himself in sort of increasingly. And this is from a chapter called We.
Mm.
We, this pronoun, it grows increasingly nervous. The pronoun may wish to apologize to anyone whom it makes nervous as well. Is this we meant to enclose the readers of the book in a kind of intersubjective cloud? Anyone still reading at this point? The stakeholders, shall we say, in the project of turning the pages of the book? Or is it a more archly ironic we, the investigative unit, the enumerators of crimes? And then in parenthesis, you're not abandoning our survey of crimes now, are you? Is there a monster at the end of this book? I mean, I mean, what can I say? It's just good writing, but yeah. Do
Thank you.
you still have imposter syndrome a little bit? Or does it get, actually, with, you have 24 books out, I think. Shyla did a little research.
Mm.
Does it get harder to want to kind of
Well,
top what's that aspect like
yeah.
of wanting to, oh my god, I've done this, I've kind of done this now, do you put yourself under this pressure to invent a new form?
Well, you know, you can kind of outlive imposter syndrome. I think, in a way, just it's not that it's debunked by some kind of absolute, refutation. Oh, they gave me this award, or X number of people have admired a given book, and so it's debunked. It just becomes it sort of fades into a meaningless, into the cloud of angst that surrounds being all the time, which is, why are we here? Why do we do what we do? And then the kind of the shrug that aging, you eventually you sort of accept, I'm this guy. I do these things.
Hmm.
And it's incredibly lucky and incredibly strange. It remains very permanently weird to get to put my most eccentric and willful thoughts into sentences and have them bound into books, which are then presented as if they're these coherent or important, cultural objects.
Well, I
I
can
mean,
tell you right now, the camera is on a yellow duck with a red bow tie and a flamingo right next to it. So, if there's any sort of, if you had, we've never met in the physical world, and I would be hard pressed to describe you as somebody who is full of himself. I can tell you that maybe this would, if you were, that this would be the best therapy, I think, to.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. But on another level, it makes me who I am, in a very positive sense, to be here and remember that this is crazy and unexpected, but it's also beautiful because it models the fact that all of these realities are constructed. I had a couple of very high moments in the around the turn of the century. I won a thing called the National Book Critics Circle Award. So you go to a room with a bunch of other writers in tuxedos and editors in tuxedos, and they call out your name like you're at the Oscars, and you go up, and then your book wears this phrase for the rest of its life: winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. But that's just Second Life too.
Mhm.
It's just a thing that happened, that was a construction in subjective space. It's only important to the people it's important to. So being this duck is this is my triumph today, to be this duck. You know what they say about Second Life, just like the song: if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
Well, tell that to my son who plays Fortnite. He doesn't care. But Okay, so let's do some reading because I really love this. I mean, I love the book, but I chose this chapter because it really you show a type of kindness where also I feel a lot of writers may have taken this. It's weird. As a reader, I start reading a chapter about a black boy and a white boy in this emerging gay relationship, in this romantic relationship, and I read it in a book called Crime Novel, and I'm thinking like, oh my God, what is he gonna do to these boys? And you don't do it, and you do something incredibly kind. And let's just read. Do you want to set this up? I mean, here they're basically
Sure, I'll set it up a little. I'll set it up a
Go
little
ahead.
bit. You did.
Yeah.
You gave me a good start. But before I do that and then read, you want me to go ahead and devote the time it will take to read this whole chapter? It's probably
8 minutes.
7, 8 minutes. Yeah. Are you happy with that?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Great. Okay. So this is about, well, it's exactly 125 pages into this, or 130 pages into this long, very strangely distributed novel where you meet many different characters. And the book will continue in this fashion. It's like a camera that's hopping around, right? Taking different pictures. But you've heard a rumor through other characters that there's a white boy and a black boy on the street who seem to retreat into a room privately, and everyone sort of feels like, yeah, oh boy, I think they might be fooling around. And it's like known and not known in the way that so many things, especially in the world of being queer in the 20th century, so many, we had famous entertainers who were everyone knew and nobody knew,
Mm-hmm.
So on the street, the activities of these two boys are a kind of a myth that no one will speak of. But there's the feeling that probably that's what's going on. And this is the first real look at them, the first time the camera really suddenly switches to them, and it switches to them totally. And I think that's probably enough of the setup.
Yeah.
The title of the chapter is Walked In On. And, there'll be some things in this, because the book refers to itself a lot, there'll be some things in this that won't quite make sense. But the main action of this chapter will be very clear.
If you feel you can skip certain things that
I
you
might
feel
skip
are not,
or stop and explain
Please,
if I'm quick enough to figure it out how to do that. So, what about those two in their secret afternoons, the black kid and white kid who are lovers? Some of the boys on the street had made a dire forecast that someone was destined to walk in on them. A parent? Was this correct? Was this going to happen? In fact, yes. Not because these boys were too quiet for too long behind closed doors, but for the opposite reason. They made too much noise. They made what is technically termed a goddamn racket. Clothes not all the way off, but not all the way on either. They'd been in their crazy space for an hour or more, playing 45s on a little portable player, listening to Bill Withers and Doris Troy and Blue Magic and other imperishable, forgotten songs from the one kid's father's dusty collection. Nothing to do anymore with the music on WBLS or in the streets, just a wonderland of their own, bounding around in their underwear, crazy, just crazy, from the wonderful touching of each other's penises. They're making up nonsense syllables to sing along with lyrics in the verses they don't know. What are they going to do? Cuddle? Spoon? They're 15-year-old boys. 3 years ago, they not only collected baseball cards, they chewed all the gum from the pack. 3 years from now, they'll be doing a little too much cocaine. Nothing they can't handle, though. Off a copy of Thriller at an after-hours club in a loft in a piano factory in Hell's Kitchen, the conversion of which represents the start of the gentrification destined to transform that neighborhood into something called Clinton. Today, they're in between those selves, the very middle of the middle of everything they sense and feel, and nothing sounds better than grab-assing around the one kid's room, jumping on and off his too small kid's bed, trying to harmonize with the exultant mopery of Blue Magic's sideshow. So let the sideshow begin. Step right on in. Can't afford to pass it by. Guaranteed to make you cry. And in strides the one kid's dad, not even rattling the door handle for warning. He spares barely an instant inspecting the scene. A glance takes in all he needs to know. Sideshow's dead right, you couple of freaks. Sorry. I told you I don't care how loud you play the goddamn music, but your bouncing on the ceiling has got to stop. About to break the goddamn house. Sorry. Hell, man, even a cat can be sorry. This elliptical remark freezes them in an instant of silence. When the father resumes, it is in an ever so slightly gentler tone. I don't give a good goddamn what you get up to behind closed doors. Just don't knock down the house on my watch. You want to bust a hole in the floor? Go do it at his house. I don't want to answer to either your mothers. You hear me? Yes, sir. Don't sir me in your underwear. The father laughs. Sir, fruits of the loom, goddamn. The boys stare wide-eyed as the father goes chuckling backward through the doorway. Our inquiry. Might it reasonably exit this room with the father? Might it conclude here for the time being? Yes, let's do leave the boys where they are, one whispering reassurance to the other that it really is okay, that the father really isn't going to tell, adjusting the volume on the portable record player. Rather than concluding, however, let's consider the father just an instant more. What enables him to convey all at once such blunt annoyance and such kindness? For, to be sure, there was kindness here. The puzzle has an answer. This particular father has been on a path of queer self-discovery, of queer self-amplification. He's been on this path for some time now, since even before joining up with the mother of his son, to whom he is devoted. Lately, this journey has carried him through some pretty funky parties on Pacific Street. It has brought him into a dalliance with one of the countermen at the sandwich shop. It has led him, even on certain nights, to Manhattan's Hudson River Drive, to the bars along Manhattan's periphery, and farther to the fabulous and notorious parked tractor-trailer trucks parked at the waterfront. It will eventually cost him his life. But not for some time. He'll be one of those the drugs keep alive, on oxygen, in a diminished, almost twilight state for decades. He'll be a survivor of those first years, the years of slaughter. He'll be watched over by his wife and son. But let's not dwell on this. It's too much for now. Not so fast, you say? What makes his wife, the boy's mother, willing to accompany the father on this journey? Is it so simple as that we should pity her this devotion, view it as a sacrifice? We'd best not assume. She might be into women. There are mysteries in the way people live. Let's stick to the moment, the father walking in. Can it be possible that what we have here is an instance of not just a good enough father, but of pure, perfect parenting? Well, maybe that's a reach. He's pretty curt. He has some fun at their expense. Yet maybe that's what makes it so perfect. There's nothing in what he's seen, his words seem to say, that's worth making such a big deal over. It's just a matter of quit making that goddamn racket. The father's remarks, curt, unsurprised, aggravated, affectionate, restore the two lovers out of the catastrophe of themselves, into the ordinary, into the everyday. Of course, to grant this, one would have to grant a world in which an adult calling a child a freak could be seen as fond, as opposed to damaging, as opposed to cruel. Such a world either did or didn't once exist. You decide. In any case, it's possible that what we've discovered here is at least neutral, that what we have before us is an uncrime. Of what relevance to our inquiry? Hard to say. Onward.
Wow. Thank you,
That's it.
Jonathan. If you're just tuning in, or if you're just coming here to the beach, Jonathan Lethem reading from his latest novel, Brooklyn crime novel, a book about remembering, about forgetting, about the right to forget, the necessity to forget or to remember. And I mean, just a wonderful book. Earlier, I was talking about imposter syndrome, and I actually really don't like that term. What I wanted to ask you is if you, since you also teach, you teach at Pomona, um, which is a very prestigious job, once held by another writer who is um, longer with us, who I'm completely obsessed with, David Foster Wallace. If you, my question about this imposter syndrome was more like, if there is a pressure that you put yourself under, or maybe also students ask you that, it's more like a obsession with originality, I guess, in terms of structure and presentation.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you? I
Well,
mean, there's no easy answer to that. I mean,
no, of course not. But it gives me a chance to say, maybe to think with that question a little bit. You know, I have a slightly unusual configuration in the way that I think, or at least the way I talk about the idea of originality or innovation. I am very deeply influenced and conscious of my dependence on models and my constant utilization of borrowed things, frameworks, language, vibes, whatever it might be. I can never ignore how openly, it seems to me, I'm taking sustenance and energy and opportunity out of things that I love. Other books, obviously, but also movies and songs and maybe even unquantifiable parts of life. Worlds, milieus, zones of feeling, or something like a day where I visit Second Life.
mhm.
And so I don't really think that this binary that a lot of people receive of sort of there's either that which is original or that which is unoriginal, dependent, influenced, copied. I don't see that the binary works for me. I think that the two things flow in and out of each other much more totally. So much that the word original maybe I don't find it so useful. I want to make things that are alive and distinct. And sometimes I want to make things, I often think in terms of making things that only I can make, but only I is me influenced.
But you
Me
teach.
full of
I was wondering because sorry
yeah,
to jump in here, but you teach
yeah,
writing. I wonder if your students go to you and say, "Please tell us how can I be," or if you get a sense that they're obsessed with that. Because I'm just thinking. I mean, I studied music and I studied classical, but I also studied jazz, and I remember this. I mean, this was 30 years ago, and there were people completely obsessed with one thing and one thing only, which is to create a new style. It was really absurd in some instances where people go like, "Oh, I'm not going to listen to bebop anymore because then that's going to go in there, and I don't want to." I mean, with musicians, maybe it's more extreme. I don't know. I only know musicians in that regard, and it's kind of extreme sometimes to what lengths people go in order to or how they obsess about
yeah.
that
Well, there's what
that
people
style
say and a vow that they
and what they
value in
do.
art and what they do. And
They
this
want to
is true also
sit
just
home and get stoned, and go like, I'm gonna just get so
yeah.
stoned that I forget all bebop, and then my style will be original.
The I mean, let's just even take it away from the act of composition or creation and talk about what we seek in our experiences, which is we feel we want radically new things that are, you know, original at all levels, or at least we sometimes crave these things. Other times we say, I want comfort food, or I want the familiar. But in fact, most of the things that we experience as radically new and different rely on so many forms of familiarity and deep understructures or superstructures of, archetypes, mythic things that are basic to the culture that we recognize instantly. And we want the new to be mixed up with the old. We want the familiar and the unfamiliar to be mixed up so that we will always know where we are in a relation to the places where something is trying to push into a new experience. If it's absolutely out in free space, well, I honestly think that it's a very, very wonderful thing that Gertrude Stein wrote The Making of Americans. It's very important for all of our lives that book exists. But I don't know a lot of people who are reading The Making of Americans for the way it nourishes their psychic, emotional, narrative pleasure centers. It's just not. It's a demonstration of what's possible, but it doesn't make that return engagement to the center of what we understand novels to be, what we experience as culture and narrative, and the way we think about our lives in a way that we can really cope with. Mm-hmm. So mostly we're not looking for this absolute originality. We're looking for versions of the old that make us feel new. And when I see my students writing, whatever they might request or declare, they are making relation to existing formula and structures and narrative and genre, because that's what we do. That's what we humans do. And in fact, if they're not, it's because they're not readers, and then they actually don't really have anything to work with at all. Mm-hmm.
Or as so Werner Herzog, I'm sorry, I keep jumping in here because Werner Herzog.
Quote Herzog,
He was asked, there's on YouTube you will find Werner Herzog saying the word read 5 minutes straight because somebody clipped it together, because when Werner Herzog apparently is asked by someone, what would you recommend a young filmmaker to do? He always answers with read. Yeah. So I guess for writers, it's probably the same thing. Or you're not recommending
absolutely
watching Netflix.
I mean, in fact, you have no possibility of generating writing as we all think of it without your reading life. It's the most obvious thing to say, but it can't be said enough. Mm-hmm. And also, there's something splendid happening here, which is that the moment we first started, someone talked about They Live in the chat. Well, I watched They Live last night, and now you're talking about Herzog, and I watched Strozek 4 nights ago.
That's his very first film, I believe.
No, not his first. Even Dwarves Started Small is his first. Strozek comes in 1977.
Okay.
But it's a wonderful. It's maybe my favorite. It's certainly a great one.
Werner Herzog, if people don't know who we're talking about, you really gotta check it out. Oh, Ulrich Blumenbach in the chat says, nice to see Jonathan coming back to concepts of narration he developed in The Arrest, says Ulrich. And actually, somebody reminded me earlier that I didn't train my camera. I'm also running camera here, by the way. Werner would be proud. Here it's now on Ulrich, who is standing here right in front of this lovely lady. I don't know if that's the person he came with, but here is Ulrich. So Ulrich says, narrative concepts, back to concepts of narration you developed in The Arrest, says Ulrich, who just translated The Arrest. We have 15 minutes left. You want to take this, Jonathan?
Yes, that's a great thing to work from, because so it's funny. You ask about my
now
striving for
originality. Now you're repeating yourself. Yeah, I see. Ulrich got it.
Yeah.
That's a subtweet. Ulrich is subtweeting you. That's what the kids
absolutely.
do.
But in fact, I do make an effort to make each book seem like a giant change from the previous book, but just for sport, because that pleases me. And also because I know it's totally impossible, because what happens is I find myself looking at myself. I always discover that I'm working with my own familiar obsessions and urgencies, and so the work all connects, because it all connects through the ways in which I'm helplessly myself. But I like to make them outwardly seem like they're left turns, Like, how could the person do that and then do this next? But someone who translates me, like Ulrich, is going to be extremely alert to this truth, which he identifies in that very fine subtweet or commentary, which is that I almost always discover some methodology, some new approach to fiction in one book that enables me, in fact, becomes central to the writing of the next book, even if they take very different forms. So The Arrest, which we're mentioning without describing it, is a post-apocalyptic pastoral set in rural Maine. So it's a small town book. It has nothing to do with New York City or my own coming of age, and it's very different outwardly. In some ways, a very gentle book, even though the world has been basically destroyed. But one of the things that I figured out, and it took a while to figure it out when I was writing it, was that I needed to look at these characters without personalizing them totally. And so I began to give a lot of the characters in that book these what you might call monikers, or they're named for their function.
In this community, it's sort of an intentional.
It's just known as the butcher.
Right.
Someone's just the butcher. So I'm letting people be described in terms of their roles, their social roles, their professional identity, and also how other people think of them. Because no one walks around thinking of themselves as, I am the butcher. But everyone else might be like, oh, look, here comes the butcher. And this form of distancing from characters who are centered in themselves to seeing the characters as they are viewed in terms of the community, well, you can see, I don't have to belabor this now. It becomes the essential insight for writing this next book, Brooklyn crime novel.
I just wanted to say that Ulrich, thank you. And Ulrich says he didn't mean to imply that. No. I was just joking with this subtweet. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier. Ulrich Blumenbach translated David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, and the German translation is absolutely amazing. I mean, it is really beyond. We're running out of time, and now I have a million questions very quickly, because Ulrich and other translators of Infinite Jest will come on next week, and we know that David Foster Wallace didn't like translators. What briefly, what is your relationship with your translators? Do you like them? Or? Well, I mean, you can't. Don't speak
in many
50
things,
languages.
Temperamentally, I'm a great admirer of Wallace's, and I also have this strangely what would you call it? Heightened but oblique relation to him, because of our co-occupation of this job. We're the only two people ever to have been the Disney professor so far, but also because I had friends who knew him before he was publishing. So we were separated by 1 degree when we were both still in college. And in fact, my friends kept saying, there's this guy, he's a writer too, you got to meet him. And then, of course, he becomes David Foster Wallace.
I actually meant your relationship with your translators, but that's even more interesting now. Oh, my God.
I'm circling back to this,
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
I learned early on that Wallace regarded his writing as untranslatable. But this is part of a kind of a psychic posture.
Yeah.
That I don't identify with at all in him. It really makes no sense. Except, in fact, that I do view it perhaps not as an ideological or cognitive situation, but maybe I actually would slightly pathologize it and say this form of solipsism may also be part of the syndrome of emotional isolations that eventually cost him his life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
And
great. That's a great point because sometimes I feel like, is he playing with that? Is this some sort of shtick or something? But no, what you said makes total sense to me. Yeah.
so, as it happens, just by temperament, not because I just made some decision, I think, first of all, of course, it's the most extraordinary privilege to be read in some other language and to think that the work might become meaningful. I mean, I think I try to think my way out of being an American every single day, but I know I am one, and my writing proceeds from my deep immersion in American experience and American culture, popular culture, often, and so that anyone might care for it in another framework is so moving to me. So, but I also believe that the art of translation is an art, that it can be extraordinary. I mean, I also, honestly, I believe there are probably many instances where translators improve the books they handle. I mean, then we have the famous examples of, Baudelaire's translations of Poe, and also the fact that Nabokov always used to become exasperated with American admirers of Dostoevsky, where he would say, if you could read him in the original Russian, you wouldn't like him so much. They fixed him. They fixed him on the way over. So, I think I'm blessed to have Ulrich and other translators laboring on my behalf. It's a kind of a miracle situation. I always offer my help whenever I can, but of course, without being bilingual, I'm a pretty useless. I'm mainly just a cheerleader on the sidelines.
Also, quick shout out to Kostas Kaltsas, who translates you into Greek. I think Motherless Brooklyn he's working on now, and he is a huge fan. He wanted to come over today, but he just wanted me to tell you that that he read all your works, but and this is me now editorializing, but the Greeks are not ready for you, Jonathan. Just one book at a time, one book at a time.
Oh no! Don't tell my Greek girlfriend this thing.
Ooh.
But this is it's an area of deep mystery and fascination. Like whose book? Once every word has been changed, which by definition it will be. Is it Ulrich's book or is it my book? This is like an ontological puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really marvelous area where you have to. In a way, this connects to one of my impulses in Brooklyn Crime Novel, which was to somehow try to dissolve the authorial self into others, to adopt other people's voices, and to try to make mine go away. That's that moment that you identified where the lyricism begins to creep in, and someone else comes in and says, "No, don't use that now."
No flowery language. Got to be more hard-boiled.
Yeah.
Okay, we got 7 minutes left. I was told I gotta be really, really brutal today. So 2 more questions. There is the term magical Negro was used, and since I was born and raised in Germany, I was not familiar. Actually, I am familiar with this term. There is an important character, C. Well, he's very important. He kind of tries to unite the neighborhood, I guess. We don't have time to get into it, but what is a magical Negro, and why did you use this term?
Well, it's a very uncomfortable phrase because it comes from the correct and very appropriate identification of a sentimental cliche, which, while it may be positively intentioned, is in some ways quite racist. Which is that in many stories told in 20th century American culture, there is a kind of helpful, black advisor or sidekick or kind of, super sensitive, super wise character whose own fate and own destiny is marginal within the story, but offers their wisdom, right? And, this can be done in ways where it's slightly forgivable, or in ways where it's extremely unforgivable. But once you spot it, you can't stop seeing that this is this really is a cliche.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, of course, one may, just to try to make it most general, perhaps, possibly in one's life, one may have
one has encountered such a person.
A self-sacrificing, helpful, wise African-American person.
Mm-hmm.
And one might want to describe their function or their role, or even, in some cases, their desire, because one of the most pernicious things about a cliche or a stereotype is that sometimes people fit themselves to them,
mm-hmm.
to some degree.
Mm-hmm. And the character in your book, do you remember such the character C in your book? And you've done the survey, and you interviewed all your friends, and you did all this research. Do a lot of them remember such a person who was this really good, kind guy who wanted to unite people, who showed them the ropes on the streets, and try to de-escalate conflict and all these things?
Well, there can be many answers to your question, because the points of view onto the environment of my childhood are, in this book, are multiple, even if they're all handled by me. But I'm going to pick the simple answer and say yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, authors usually, it's precisely at this moment they want to say, well, in fiction everything is real and not real. It's always true and not true. And I believe that there's a reason for that kind of squirreliness. But here I think it's simplest just to say, of course, yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, everybody should get this book, and if they're German, they should also get Der Stillstand. Jonathan Lethem, thank you so much for coming. Book is excellent. Thank you, audience here in World and on YouTube. If you enjoy what we do, please consider supporting. You can, I think, subscribe to the channel. I also have a Substack, because everybody has a Substack. Mine is free and will always remain free. And I only send out notices when we have a new book club, or if I'm working on an SL video or something. It was a real pleasure. I hope you come back. You know where the yellow duck is. The yellow duck will remain here.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure as before.
You may now poof, and I just wanted to also give a big shout out to Shyla, who created this slideshow here. People have seen it in World. This is a slideshow of images from a Google search of 70s Brooklyn, and then here on the side, this is just random clips of Brooklyn school integration. This is a documentary from, or I think it may have been a TV broadcast from '73. So these are sort of these visual things on the side, because people ask me what that is all about. We have a few sponsors that I'm going to run through real quick, and then I'm going to tease the next show. Bespoke Caravan is sponsoring us, meaning they give us Second Life stuff and gear. They make fantastical avatars, as you know. Then we also are sponsored by the Black Forest, Arden Schwartzman, making board games. And actually, we have someone here in the audience who wears a repairman suit, also made by the Black Forest. Here we go. Venice here on the big screen. And we have a new sponsor. Let me locate my slide. LAQ, or LAQ. In Second Life since 2006. I cannot believe it. Thank you for sponsoring, and I can't find my credit slides. The show is produced by me. Shyla is doing research. The avatars are by Arieto. So I don't know where my credit slides are. They're not in that folder. But anyway, I have a slide here to tease the show next week. For all the folks who came on the 27th and we had technical issues, we're going to make this show happen next week on the 10th, January 10th. Oops, the slide is not resing. And this is a special, here we go, Infinite Jest Translator panel discussion. If you don't know what Infinite Jest is, then you have never been to this book club, because I talk about it every week. I squeeze it in however I can. And from left to right, we'll have Ulrich Blumenbach, Igor Tsivanovic, Kostas Kaltsas, and Moeen Farouki. I hope I didn't mess up the pronunciation. So that is next week. And oh yeah, we have a tip jar here. If you have loose Linden dollars in your pocket, throw them into this tip jar. Thank you guys. And for the YouTube folks, I'm going to play us out with a little bit of music from Captain Beefheart. See you all next week.
Happy with the khaki sweatband, bowed goat pot-bellied barnyard that only he noticed. The old fart was smart. The old gold cloth Madonna. Dancing to the fiddle and saw, he ran down behind the knoll and slipped on his wooden fish head. The mouth worked and snapped all the bees back to the bungalow. Mama was flattening lard with her red enameled rolling pin when the fish head broke the window, rubber eye erect and precisely detailed. Air holes from which breath should come is now closely fit, with the chatter of the old fart inside. An assortment of observations took place. Mama licked her lips like a cat, pecked the ground like a rooster, pivoted like a duck, her stockings down caught dust and dough balls, she cracked her mouth, glazed, caught one eyelash, rubbed her hands on her gorgeous gingham, her hands grasped sticky metal, intricate latchwork, opened to the room. Smell cold mixed with bologna, rubber bands, crumpled wax paper bonnets, fat goose legs, and special jellies, ignited by the warmth of the room. The old fart smelled this through his important breather holes. Cleverly he dialed from within. From the outside we observed that the nose of the wooden mask, where the holes had just been a moment ago, was now smooth, amazingly blended, camouflaged in with the very intricate rainbow trout replica. The old fart inside was now breathing freely from his perfume bottle atomizer air bulb invention. His excited eyes from within the dark interior